Hi, everybody.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Welcome to our third MTS speaker series of the spring semester. We thank the Glushko and Samuelson Foundations for funding, which is partly funding these delicious snacks. Today's speaker is Dr. Matt Zefferman, who comes to us from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. I've known Matt a long time. We went to grad school together. Matt did his undergraduate at Cornell, where he took Introduction to Cognitive Science with Michael Spivey in 1999.
That was my last exposure to cognitive science, so if you have any questions I can't answer, then it's his fault.
He did his Ph.D. in ecology at UC Davis, followed by a postdoc at the University of Tennessee, and in the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, followed by another postdoc in anthropology at Arizona State, and followed by, he is currently the Donald Beale Fellow at the Naval Postgraduate School. Matt does all sorts of things, including some pretty heavy math modeling of evolutionary dynamics and social learning, and lately has been doing some anthropological field work on things related to mental health, in particular PTSD. And with that, let's welcome Matt Zefferman.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone. It's been really great to come out to Merced. It's my first time actually in the town of Merced, and getting used to your department, which is really interdisciplinary, which is great. I have, as Paul kind of stated, kind of an eclectic background, and I'm really interested in hearing any advice or comments and any questions from you guys to get your perspective on this study, which is already in the disciplinary department. So that's my funding. I'm at Naval Postgraduate School. All right, so I'm going to start off with this. All right, one thing, there are many types of trauma in the world that people talk about. People that study trauma from a psychiatric perspective, you have natural disasters, you have interpersonal violence, you have terrorist attacks, and people participating in warfare. And there's this kind of idea in psychiatry that these types of trauma all have similar responses for different people. I'm going to talk specifically here about combat trauma. My background is kind of mathematical models of warfare, and combat trauma is kind of weird. And so here you have two. You guys can see this okay? It's not too light. Okay, so you have two folks. They're sitting in some comfortable chairs, probably somewhere in Nevada, in an Air Force base. And what they can be doing in a setup like this is flying drone operations in some place like Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. And they're not really in any physical danger. They're sitting comfortably in their chairs. They have computer screens, but people who have done psychiatric evaluations of these drone operators have found that they have many, if not all, the symptoms of PTSD, which is kind of puzzling because they're not, this shouldn't be a very traumatic experience. And the question that people have is why is this like that? There's this book that came out last year. So that's kind of like, combat trauma is weird, but it is weird. And what this is, maybe if you guys have been around Paul, otherwise you know what WEIRD stands for, is Western Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic Societies. This is Stephen Younger, who wrote this book, New York Times bestseller last year, about PTSD. And his idea is that PTSD is something that's really unique to Western societies, in that people in more traditional small-scale societies shouldn't get PTSD because they have various systems of survival that keep them from getting these symptoms. And there has been a little bit of literature in evolutionary psychology about PTSD, and the idea here is that PTSD is an overlearned survival response to something that's a near-death experience. So, and I'll get into more of the details here later. The idea is that people have a traumatic experience, and it'd be really good not to go through that again. So they have what they call avoidance symptoms, which are things that keep you from experiencing that traumatic experience again. And you also have reliving symptoms that mean that you have nightmares and flashbacks where this one time you have this experience, you replay it over and over again, and that kind of helps you learn about it so that you avoid it in the future. And some of the evidence for this that they bring up are there's some correlates, and these are all behavioral correlates in other animals because you can't ask them questions about their internal mental states. And there's some papers about potential PTSD-like things in elephants, chimpanzees, dogs that were abandoned in Fukushima disaster, and a ton of laboratory experiments with basically rodents where they traumatize them and see how they respond to that. And kind of the general idea in evolutionary psychology, and actually in the clinical literature, is that all this type of trauma is very context independent. It doesn't matter really what kind of trauma you have, people kind of have the same types of symptoms in response to it. Meanwhile, there's this literature in medical anthropology. This is kind of the classic book from 1996 by Alan Young. And what they do is they go and they are interested in how the psychological industry, the psychiatrists come and they kind of invent psychological disorders. And the idea is that the ways we think about trauma over time depend a lot on whatever the political and social ideas are at the time, and this even gets reflected in the clinical diagnoses. So there are kind of ideas that PTSD is real and people really suffer from it, and not to minimize that, but that it's socially constructed based on the social and political world. So it's like very different from the evolutionary psychology standpoint, which is that it's generally universal. It's more of like, yeah, it really just comes out of the society you're in. And then there's these cross-cultural psychologists who basically go in, and most of this work is done with refugees like Cambodia and places like that, where they go in and say like, really people in lots of different cultures have very different responses to trauma that if you come at it from a Western perspective, you're not going to understand because you have to go in and actually find out how people experience. And again, this is an idea that things are really cross-culturally different. And so the question is is PTSD really unique to modern societies that don't have these traditional systems to support, where you have basically, at least in the combat sense, you have warriors going off to Afghanistan or Iraq, and they're coming back, and they have a very different situation than a small-scale society. And these are the two questions. Is PTSD universal with these kind of deep evolutionary roots, or is it socially constructed and maybe unique to Western societies? And one of the problems with all this literature is that no one's actually gone and looked at combat stress in a small-scale society. All this work has been done either with refugees or it's been done on American soldiers where there's a lot of money and easy access. So what I did is this field work in Turkana County, which is in northwest Kenya, kind of borders Uganda, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And the people I was working with were Turkana pastoralists. Pastoralists are people who raise animals for a living, so it's where they get their food and it's the store of wealth. Turkana raise cows, goats, sheep, donkeys, and camels. That's 5, right? Yeah. So they raise those 5 animals. And this is it's a semi-arid region. Here you have some women getting water out of a watering hole. Basically, they've dug into a dry stream bed to get some water so they can water their animals and themselves and shower and bathe and things. So it's a pretty austere environment. And they're semi-nomadic, which means that with the seasons, they travel from place to place to wherever there's pasture where they can feed their animals. This is kind of a typical Turkana house. It's made with sticks, sometimes covered with a tarp. These ones are really hot, so you don't want to be in this one on a hot day. But the other one is, but it's better for rain. And the other one is nice. And you can see that here. And the nice thing about these shelters is they're pretty portable. So even if you go to a place where there's not a lot of vegetation, where you can, which is often the case, you can carry the sticks with you. And donkeys they pretty much use for the pack animals. The specific location I was in the Lopiti Plain, which is about right there. So various places in there was where I did my field work. That's about 50 or 60 kilometers from the border with South Sudan. And the Turkana people I was doing research with were Cortella people, which is a subpopulation, and they do a lot of raiding relative to other Turkana. And they raid mostly into South Sudan against a group called Zakosa. And what raiding is they'll go out and try to get animals from, and that brings up another ethnic group. And the reason why is because if you need animals, you can either let them grow, and that takes some time, or you can go out and take them, which can be very dangerous. These are some Turkana kind of gathering before they go out on a raid. My collaborator took this picture when she was in the field. And the combat exposure for Turkana is pretty high. A little over 50% of the male mortality in the Cortella people is due to raiding. So it's pretty significant. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's pretty significant, but also from just the day-to-day life, this is a pretty significant number. And in my study, so we did a study, interviewed 213 Turkana. I think it was 48%, so about half of them had at least one visible bullet wound, which is a nice measure of combat exposure because we can actually, they show it to us and we can see what it is. Some of them had up to 5 or 6 bullet wounds. Oh yeah, so this is just basically how we just put on the field, and these are our tents. And the way we would do the survey is we would go out to an area where Turkana were settled. This is an example. We kind of roll in and talk to people, and we'd often bring water with us, and then we would interview anyone who'd be willing to interview. We didn't pay anybody, we just asked people for their time. we'd go and ask. This is us trying to find. Sometimes the men wouldn't be around because they felt hurting, so this is us trying to go and find where the men were, see if we could talk to some people. So we interviewed 218 warriors, and this is kind of typically how we'd set it up. We had a tablet where we collect data. I would be there most of the time, or at the beginning all the time, but then most of the time. And I worked with, I don't speak very much Turkana, definitely not enough to do a survey about PTSD and people's experiences, so I worked with local research assistants. But we had like a semi-structured interview on the tablet. We interviewed a large range of people, so we interviewed some old men, well actually anyone we could. So some men were pretty old, like this man who maybe it's been decades since he raided, and some young men who maybe returned from a raid the day before, or were going out on a raid. And by the end, we had it set up so that we had a number of trained research assistants. So we go into an area and interview multiple people at a time, which is good, because if it rained, we would be stuck. We'd be stuck here for a few days, because there's no way we could get the vehicle out of this area if it rained. We collected a lot of data. We collected demographic data, measures of combat exposure, what symptoms of PTSD they might have, moral beliefs, some information on moral entry and ritual participation. I'll talk about those later. And now I'm going to talk about the PTSD symptoms that we measured. If you go to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, the current version, there's a PTSD symptom list of 20 symptoms. And we used what's called the PTSD Checklist 5, which is basically you ask the individuals if they've experienced these symptoms, and then you ask how much it's bothered them in the last month. And there's a Likert scale associated with this. There's a 5-point scale. It goes from 0 to 4. It goes from Mamjik, which means not at all, to Noi, which means extremely. And how much is bothering last month? If they say Noi Cha, that means quite a bit, and we read 4 to 3. Okay. And then the question is, okay, do Turkana warriors have symptoms of PTSD? And I'll tell you, going into this, the anthropologist I was working with thought that they would not have very much of it, based on her years of field work. I didn't really know because I'd never been there, so I didn't have a very strong prior. She had a prior. And it turned out, yeah, they actually have a good amount of PTSD, according to this criteria. And so what this is there's 20 questions. There's 20 symptoms. They range from 0 to 4. The maximum score is 80, so just add them up. And generally in the psychology literature, if someone has a score of above 33, then you can, greater than or equal to 33, you consider that as a provisional diagnosis of PTSD. We're not clinicians, so we can't say someone has PTSD. We can only do a provisional diagnosis. And I'll talk a little bit about like how valid this is when you do it cross-culturally, but it turned out that the people scored higher than you would expect. So it ended up being about 20%. Generally, combat veterans that have actually fought in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan come back as about 12 to 14 to 15%, depending on the study and who they sample. So it's about double that. Now there's a question is like, oh, does a 3 for a Turkana mean the same thing as a 3 for a veteran? Because you're doing different cultures and there's different translations, so that's hard to do. And I'll talk about how we're trying to get around that in a little bit. But we actually had them describe their symptoms, and in the way they describe their symptoms, and I've shown this to clinical psychologists, and they say like, oh yeah, this is what we're looking for. So at least qualitatively, it's the same. And this is actually much higher than someone would expect. All right. And like I said, I'll get into a little bit how we try to do like comparison later. But right now I'm talking about like what are the origins of combat stress. So it seems like Turkana people, even though they're in a society where warfare is very common, where the whole society is really geared towards fighting other people and getting cattle, they seem to have these symptoms. Okay, so I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, so I'm interested in the evolutionary questions. And so what are the origins of combat stress? And so what we're going to propose is that these are kind of the standard ways that the symptoms are classified. You have re-experiencing symptoms, avoiding reminders of the traumatic experience. You have like negative mood symptoms, you kind of consider some of the depressive symptoms, and you have this heightened arousal, and I'll go into those. And as we were talking about before, evolutionary psychology, these are proposed to be genetic adaptive. And if you go into evolutionary psychology literature, there's really only certain symptoms they actually talk about as being evolutionary adaptive, and I'll talk about these. And those are re-experiencing symptoms and some of the heightened arousal symptoms. And okay, so here's an example of a re-experiencing symptom, it's flashbacks. And this is the question we asked, translated into Turkana. After the raid, did you have a sudden feeling or start acting as if the raid were actually happening again, as if you were actually reliving it? And this is an answer that one of the participants said. I once arose suddenly from sleep and started shooting my gun abruptly without caring where. Pup, pup, pup. Other people came in, grabbed the gun, and pulled me down. I thought that the previous death scenario was happening again. People came in and said it was not happening again and to calm down. Others thought I had edukopia. Edukopia is word just meaning total confusion. And here's another re-experiencing symptom, startle. After the raid, did you feel jumpy or easily startled? Sorry, this is a hypervision. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, as I said earlier, re-experiencing symptoms are thought to be things that help you remember what had happened. So you experience the raid over and over again in this traumatic experience, and maybe you want to avoid it, is the idea of that. Here's a startle symptom. After the raid, did you feel jumpy or easily startled? And this is one of the participants. One day I woke with a gun ready to shoot, thinking the enemy was walking slowly to attack me while I was asleep. Later I realized it was a camel grazing close by, so I lowered the gun. Some days later I rose and got scared with a kudakut, which is the sound of a donkey running. I woke up and fired quickly, pop, thinking the enemies were running. Unfortunately, the bullet destroyed the forelimbs of the donkey. And here's a hypervigilance example. After the raid, did you feel jumpy or easily startled? Anytime I hear anything, I suspect it is an enemy. I become alert and carefully make sure it is not. I prove it is a tree. Then I keep on moving. Hearing an animal running away, yum, 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 I make sure it is an animal before I continue. So this is, again, like the response that people have is they're hypervigilant or they're easily startled, which means that they're, potentially they have the psychology that's making them wait for the next traumatic experience or the next attack. Okay. Here's an avoidance symptom. I decided to leave that place of the battle so that nobody would ever see me there again. I migrated somewhere else because I would not stay where my animals were raided by the enemies, a place where my people were killed. I would not stay in that place ever again. So here, though this kind of makes an evolutionary sense because you have people that were in a place where something bad happened, and this warrior is going to avoid that place because he doesn't want that bad thing to happen again. But here's another avoidance symptom. Same question. I avoided reminders of the raid to the extent of throwing away the knife I had taken from the raid. I threw it away knowing that it was the one that had been used to kill many people. Why should I possess it then? So this one's a little bit weird, right? Because throwing away this knife doesn't seem to have the same kind of evolutionary benefits as leaving this place where a raid happened, because that knife's not going to cause any damage or any problem. And so, what's that about? I'm trying to answer it. Okay, so you have these PTSD symptoms, and then you have these other ones that are a little bit hard to explain from evolutionary theory. And in the papers, they say that we can't really explain this. And these are sometimes thought as more depressive symptoms. So one of them is loss of interest. Here's a question. After the raid, did you lose interest in activities that you used to enjoy? And one of the warriors said, I abandoned everything that my other age mates who were not involved in the raid did. I kept away from them and chose to stay away from the area. Even while they were playing, I would just stare at them. Which again doesn't seem to have a very good evolutionary, doesn't seem to be a very evolutionary good behavior. And so what ended up doing was we want to know, well, how does Turkana combat stress compare to US combat veterans? You have these different symptoms, how do they compare? And so, like I was saying earlier, it's kind of hard to say like whether a US person, if they answer like a 3, if it's the same thing as Turkana. So what we end up doing is comparing symptom to symptom. So what we did is we took all the people, we got a database from the VA, some VA researchers, Veterans Affairs researchers about PTSD in Western soldiers and American combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And we, which scored really high on the scale because there are people that were in the VA system. And so we ended up cutting off both the Turkana and the Western soldiers. People had a score over 33. So this is just the high scoring people. And we made a comparison symptom by symptom. So you could think like if someone scored a 50 in the US soldier population and someone scored a 50 in Turkana, you could use that to kind of normalize which of, given that score of 50, what is overrepresented, what's underrepresented. And it turned out the means and the standard deviations were really close. They're within a point or two, so we just took a straight score. So we didn't really do any normalizing, these are just straight scores for each symptom, and we compared them. And so what this is there ended up being 701 veterans in the Western sample, and 62 Turkana warriors that scored over that threshold. And this is the number of people that scored 2 or greater. And the reason why we did that is kind of really like answering 0s and 4s. And US soldiers, so they had like this really convex distribution of scores, and Western soldiers tend to have a very concave one. So people tended to answer like around 3 was normally like the mode. So in order to take that, we just took everyone that's 2 or higher, which is the psychologists use a lot. So we went with it. And these are the fraction of each sample that each symptom that scored over 2 or higher. Okay. And so these triangles that are blue I think they're blue. I'm colorblind. I'm pretty sure they're blue. Are they blue? Okay, the blue ones are the ones that have the good evolutionary explanations that the evolutionary psychologists like. And I picked that because I'm using what they say because I don't want to cherry pick things based on the data. So this is what a priori is in the literature. And they tend to be fairly high and pretty similar between the 2 groups. The squares are ones that are a little bit ambiguous about whether there's good evolutionary explanation. So one of them is avoiding reminders, which is the example between like avoiding a place versus avoiding a knife. And the other one's insomnia, which can either be depressive or it can be because people are having nightmares. And so it's a little bit hard to parse those out given the question. So the ones with the decent evolutionary explanations are pretty similar, and they're kind of clustered towards the top. These are the rest of them. Some of them seem pretty similar, but you have this drop on the Turkana side where there are a good number of symptoms, and this is all significant, which is what those, everything in this is significant. And they are ones that Turkana seem to experience less. And we know that they're interpreting the questions the same because we have descriptions of their symptoms. And granted, some of these, we don't have a lot of descriptions because they're pretty low, but we have descriptions of them and they seem consistent. So we know we're at least asking the question right. And so what's that about? Like, why are Turkana on a lot of these things, especially the evolutionary ones, similar, that on these other ones that are more depressive or we don't really know are they less? And I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, so I want to get an evolutionary explanation for this. And the question that I think the answer hinges on this thing called moral injury, which is becoming pretty popular in normal psychiatry, which is that this idea that not all of trauma, especially combat trauma, so things that veterans experience, is due to fear response to traumatic experiences. That some of it is due to, this is the definition from the paper about this, is perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And what's this nice for the cross-cultural study is that, fear is fear, but moral beliefs and expectations can vary a lot between societies. In this literature, when I gave this talk for the first time, a version of the talk a year and a half ago, there were 2 books about moral injury out, and this slide was much less crowded. I ran out of room on the slide, but this is something that's been really exploding in at least the popular press and in the psychiatric literature, moral injury. And it's hard to keep up on. And this goes kind of back to these drone pilots, and people who have studied them say that what they're doing is basically what they call killing in high definition. And the idea here is that if you have like an F-16 pilot who's actually flying a plane over a battlefield, I guess it's targeting information, drops a bomb, and explodes and maybe kills people, that F-16 pilot doesn't know what happened because he's flying 300 miles an hour or more away, and as far as he doesn't see the consequences. But these drone pilots, after they bomb something, they have high definition cameras that are focused on an area and they see the aftermath. And if they kill civilians or even non-civilians, they can see in graphic detail what occurred. And the idea is that's what is causing this PTSD response in drone pilots, is the fact that they're able to witness the destruction that they've wrought, and then they have these moral, and then they go home that evening and have dinner because they live, they're working where they live. And so that it creates this disconnect between what their moral beliefs are that they interact with on a daily basis and what they experience. And there's a big debate right now about how much moral injury and PTSD are the same things. Is moral injury part of PTSD? Are they separate? Do they overlap? Are they comorbid? It's a really big debate. This is kind of a question mark here because the psychiatrists haven't figured this out. But this is kind of an idea, is that you have these kind of insomnia, depression, and sadness that are kind of in the middle, that maybe both are parts of both. And then you have some that are traditionally part of PTSD and some new things that are starting to deal with moral injury. I'm going to go into a little bit of the evolutionary story here. This is a paper that I published with Sarah Matthews, the anthropologist I work with, a few years ago, which is an evolutionary theory of warfare, which this comes out of. Some of you might have read it. I think I sent it to Paul. before you guys read ahead. And the kind of evolutionary story of warfare, I think, is necessary to understand the evolutionary story of combat stress. And the first part is that genetic selection is really a risky thing if you're doing war. And the reason why is because it's a collective action problem. Like, your group might do better if you win a war, but you as an individual could die, which is pretty serious from a genetic fitness standpoint because then you can't have offspring. Or if you do have offspring, no one's there to help raise them. In chimpanzees, they have what's called people that study, like Richard Wrangham, who study intergroup violence in chimpanzees, which is one of the only other, definitely the other mammals, one of two other mammal species that does kind of intergroup conflict. They have what's called the imbalance of power hypothesis, which is basically like chimpanzees only attack members of another group if they have really good odds, so basically 4 to 1. So in chimpanzees, the attacking group hardly ever suffers even an injury during a battle. But humans don't do that. We fight in wars where lots of people die. In Turkana, it's over 50% of adult mortality. In the Civil War, something like 12% of soldiers died. And so we have we go in this really high risk warfare for people who aren't genetically related to us at all. I mean, these are basically genetic strangers. And the reason why is we think that this occurs is because of cultural evolution. And the idea is that culture invents moral norms. So culture comes up with standards of behavior, and then it also invents systems of punishment and reward that that encourage what they call pro-social behavior, which in this case is warfare, which is kind of a weird way to think of pro-social, but it encourages behavior and helps solve collective action problems. In pastoral groups or some work, the Turkana definitely have punishment institutions, so the punishing of people who free ride in warfare, which means that they will go to the battle, but they won't actually go and fight. They'll kind of hang back, maybe take some animals at the end of the raid. There's really strong norms of punishment, so if someone gets caught doing this, they basically get beat and their animals taken away. And then there's another group of pastoralists, Nagatam, where another anthropologist found that they get rewarded, like people tend to don't really have punishment, but they get a lot of rewards if they participate in warfare. And then what ends up happening is that in punishment, rewards have important genetic fitness consequences. So you have this cultural system of punishments and rewards, and that evolves. And then what happens is then all of a sudden genes respond to that, because now if you're not conforming to the norms of behavior in society, you can have big genetic consequences. You can get your resources taken away. You can be socially sanctioned from the group, and you can create a strong incentive to learning the norms of your society and adhering to them. And in the evolutionary anthropology literature, which I think is in psychology now, they call this norm psychology, which is the idea that people are born in different societies that have different norms of behavior, and it's a really good idea to learn what those norms of behavior are and adapt them, because otherwise you're not going to fit into your society and do very well. So you have genetic selection inventing mechanisms that would discourage war because you don't want to and other traumatic experiences because you don't want to lose offspring that way. And we might expect those mechanisms to be more universal. So these things like the evolutionary psychologists talk about. So you have a traumatic experience, no matter what the context. Paul's looking confused, so I'm explaining to him. you have these things that look, you have these, anyway, yeah, so no matter what the context, it shouldn't matter. You have a traumatic experience, you avoid it. And then you have cultural selection that invents these social institutions that are applied to how and why war is waged. And we might express these norms to be cross-culturally variable because different societies have different norms. Okay. And so one of the things we did is we went to the Turkana and asked them about different moral beliefs. Is there a clock? Oh, it's up there. And so we asked them, one of the things we asked them a lot of different moral beliefs about war, but I'm just going to focus on killing for now, when you can and can't kill in war. And the reason why is because killing is one of the things in the, for US combat veterans, killing someone on the other side, either civilian or military, that people seem to have the most moral injury about. And so we asked, is it permissible to kill blank during a raid? So we asked about infants, small children, older people, adults, and elderly at both genders. So in general, what ends up happening is Turkana will say that it's permissible to kill, and this is just getting at the moral beliefs, basically males, especially adults, not old men, and then women less. So this is, for example, 39% of Turkana say that it's permissible to kill an old woman during a raid, and 61% say it's not. And if anyone wants to know why people say that this isn't how it works, I can tell you, but the point right here is that there's a lot of variation, especially, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if they have particular religious beliefs about afterlife.
Yeah. Not really. I mean, so it's kind of weird. I mean, yeah, one of my collaborators that works in this area has done a big religious study, and there's the Christian missionaries around, and so like some of that has like seeped into people's ideas. I don't think there's a really good sense of like heaven, like that kind of thing. There's this idea of like, it's kind of an animist in general, like people have these ideas of different spirits that have various motivations. But then there's some people have this idea, maybe talk to them, of like, they have kind of an idea of there's like an overarching Christian God, but it's not really that. It's not like us where we have like a Bible or people have like doctrine where this is what we believe. It's much more loose than that.
So like they wouldn't imagine that these people that they might kill would go somewhere.
No, I don't think there's anything like that. I haven't asked that question specifically, but just my general sense from the religious beliefs are not. But I could be wrong. That'd be really interesting to ask. So I'd say like 90% sure they don't, but I'm not the 10%. Good. That's a good question. It didn't come up. I want to say that. Yeah.
Do you have like kind of like age norms? So I'm seeing like in both like the elderly women and elderly men, it's like the elderly men are the ones that they're just kind of closer to 50-50 for saying that it's not reasonable to kill an older man. It's like, do they have like they respect your elder kind of like culture to them?
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. I think definitely for the women. So,
Right.
okay, so here's the story. I'll just say the story. So kind of you ask, people have different answers, because you'll find this as an anthropologist a lot. You'll go and ask people like why they believe, you'll find that with us too. You ask them like why, it's not just people that are in small scale society. People often like post hoc come with reasons why they believe things, so you always have to take this with a grain of salt. Like if you ask a liberal, like why do you believe this one thing, like, or a conservative, like anything. Like people, I just said liberal because I tell people are liberal, so I would pick on nicer. But people always come with post hoc recommendations, even if it's not really thought out. But generally, the most common answer to the like why question is people will say like, oh, a small boy could grow into a warrior that will have to fight someday, or an infant boy will. A girl, so you see like the older girl slightly more than the woman, like, oh, an older girl will have more, she might have sons who will fight someday, or a smaller girl. And then I say the elderly women and the elderly men, they're not reproductive anymore. We said basically like a man too old to fight, so it's a fairly old man. And so they'll say like, well, they're not a threat, they're not gonna have any children. The women, elderly women, they'll say like it's like their mother. So there's like, well, like that sometimes happens. You see an old woman and she's like my mother, and how could I kill someone like my mother? So I think for the women, there's like maybe a little bit of respect for elder, but it's more of like respect for someone who's like my mother. For the old man, I think there's like a little bit of empathy there, but they basically say like they're not a threat. They take a very when you ask this kind of question, they take kind of a utilitarian answer a lot of the time. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had met any people who used to live in this community but moved. Is it just like everyone who's part of this community is part of this community and nobody leaves?
No, people are moving all the time. So,
have you interviewed them? And do they?
Yeah, but it's kind of weird because it's not like people like live in a place like we have this conception like I lived in Tennessee for a while, and then I moved to California, and then I lived there. For them, it's like they move like all the time people are moving, and so it's just like a mix. So we're basically getting people that are passing through that area, and that might be like kind of place they tend to live, but it's not like the communities are very transitory, and so it's definitely. There definitely are people who like have adopted more education. Like there are a good number of families. So there's this initiative now where pastoralists have lots of children, and some of them are starting to realize that like when times are tough, it's good to have some people who live in town that can earn some money, and so they can buy things when the animals are dead, from drought, for example. And so it'd be maybe interesting to talk to people like that who go to town and go to school. Basically, they're Christian missionary schools. So I bet they would have very different norms. Because that's basically who RAs are people that go to Christian missionary schools that know English. And they have different ideas because they go to church. It'd be really hard to separate that from people that go to mass and learn about killing and stuff. But no, I guess the simple answer is no, I haven't talked to them like that. This stuff. Oh yeah, I should say feel free to interrupt. No, actually, I prefer it because it means that people are listening. All right, moral violations. All right, so the question is, okay, this is what people say is permissible, right? And this looks pretty bad. Like I was putting this slide together. This is actually fairly new data that I've just put into graph form like the last couple of weeks. And I was putting this slide together, and my wife looked at this and she said, wow, they really like to kill everybody, right? But if you actually look at it, so this is actually people who have reported killing. And you know, maybe people are hiding it from me, but my sense is that there's no real reason. I mean, they know I'm not going to sanction them. They don't sanction themselves. There's no real reason to hide something from me. But this is basically like people who have reported killing, which is 72% of the population. So this is the percentage of warriors who said they have killed. You know, most of them have killed adult men, which is what, you know, this also includes defensive. So if the posts say are raiding Turkana, this also happens then. So some of those killings might be in there. But they really are killing a lot of people that are not adult men. And what this different color is, and I don't remember, it's like red and green maybe? Okay, so the green is people who said that it's like not permissible to kill, for example, an elderly woman, but they did, like they report having to do it. And I don't know when they developed this aversion to killing before or after, but it's like people who, when we surveyed them, said it's not permissible, but then they actually killed an elderly woman. And that's like less than 1%. Actually, most of those are like one person that said that killed a bunch of people, and then said it was wrong. The rest of them, so even though there's this like kind of this idea, like about 50-50 with some demographic groups that it's okay to kill people, it generally doesn't happen a lot. And when it does, it's not by people who say it's not okay. It mostly happens with adult men. Yeah.
Just a quick question. For the warriors who report having killed children, do you have a sense of if this is like opportunistic or more like accidental? Like they were in bits of the raid, this happened, or that, hey, as long as we're here, let's take out some people who in the future could be opposition?
It's like mostly accidental is my impression. I didn't break it out in the data. It's one of those things where I go back and I'm kicking myself for not being more specific. I do have some transcripts of the interviews that I haven't had translated yet, where I wasn't there, and then maybe some of that's in there. But just from conversation when I am there, a lot of the killings are accidental killings. They're like so the folks, the Toposa also live in compounds similar to the Turkana, where they have these kind of stick-like structures they live in, and then maybe a fence to keep the animals in. Like maybe they'll temporarily pen them in at night. And then sometimes they'll have, this doesn't always happen like this, but sometimes there'll be a raid where they're just like shooting into the buildings. And a lot of the deaths happen that way. So they're kind of like, it's not so much accidental because they know it can happen. So it's not like I was shooting at a man, it's just like I'm just shooting here and like God sorted out basically, or like, you know, the spirits, you know, what will happen. So a lot of it are like that, but there are some cases where people have killed. And I think my impression is it's like a minority of people that really want to kill. Because it often will be something like, oh, I saw some old lady, some old women, and they were begging, and I said, I'm not going to kill you, but then someone else came after I left and killed them. So there's some of that. But my impression is it's mostly accidental. But I don't have the data to say for sure. All right, and so, okay, so yeah, so the next part is you have these kind of not a whole lot of moral violations, but you know the moral injury is lower, and so like one of the things we're trying to get at is we're trying to figure out, and we haven't nailed this thing in the head, but we're trying to figure out. We haven't hit the head nail. It made kind of sense in my head. All right, so we're trying to figure this out anyway. We're trying to figure out. There's lots of different ways that Turkana society is different than, and Turkana warfare is different than our kind of warfare that might make moral injury less. One way is. It kind of seems like Turkana have a lot of moral autonomy. And what I mean is that they often can make their own moral decisions, which might not be available to, I was in the military for 6.5 years before going to grad school. And you know, it's kind of true, it's like you don't have a lot of autonomy in general, and you might be asked to do things that you're not super comfortable with, which definitely happened a lot in Vietnam, which is where PTSD kind of came out of. And so here's a vignette, and where this came from is I did a pilot study with like 56 individuals and talked to them like in detail about their experiences and try to get ideas. And this was a story, which one is this? Okay, and this is a story that I found out that sometimes when they have these big raids, so these raids can be up to 300 people on the Turkana side going on a raid, and they'll have a meeting where the leaders of each age set, which are groups of people about the same age, get together and they discuss like how the raid's going to go. And you have a raid leader who is coordinating that activity. The raid leader doesn't have authority over people, can't tell people what to do, but the raid leader just kind of helps coordinate the action and come up with a plan. And sometimes they discuss like who you can kill, like basically what are the rules of engagement. So here's the scenario based on the story that I heard. Edipal is a leader of a large raid. Before going on the raid, many of the Turkana warriors gathered to discuss what would happen on the raid. Ekalele said, on this raid, let's kill all the enemy, including the elderly, the women, and the small children. Aloy disagreed, saying, we should kill only the men, but we should not kill the elderly women and the small children. So you have two folks who are disagreeing about who you can kill. And then Edipal, the leader, has to decide like what is the rule going to be. And when I was doing the pilot, it came up like 2 or 3 times where I heard the story, I started asking people about it. And they were for different raids, they were the same raid. It always came up this, is that the raid leaders decided we're gonna leave it to each person's personal choice, everyone will just decide on their own. Right? Which if you're the leader makes sense, like you just don't wanna like get anyone on anyone's bad side, you just wanna say, okay, we'll just do a compromise, everyone just does what they want. But when I asked like what should the leader do to all the Turkana participants, you know, a good fraction said, agreed with one side or the other, and the leader should side with them. And so what this says to me is that the Turkana have lots of individual variation with what they want and what they think the rules for killing should be. And that was on the earlier slide. But when it comes down to it, the decisions actually gets made, lets everyone do what they are morally comfortable with, as opposed to being top-down dictated from the top. Yeah.
I guess I'm sort of puzzled, I guess, maybe I'm naive, but isn't this all against the law in the country they're in? How do they have moral autonomy?
It's, okay, so,
right? I mean,
yeah, so this is a whole other thing. So there's a government of Kenya, right, which is headquartered far away from the Turkana. And they have very weak national institutions, especially outside of the towns. And there have been attempts over time to stop raiding from happening. And there's kind of a few issues with it. One is that you take the guns away. You try to take the guns away, and they kind of don't like having their guns taken away. And then like maybe 15 years ago, there was a big Kenyan police force that came in to dearm the Turkana and basically got slaughtered. And so the Turkana government, or the Kenyan government decided like maybe that's not a good idea to try to disarm the Turkana. The other thing is if you are successful in that, the Posa in South Sudan, where there's basically no, especially in the pastoral, there's basically no government. They're going to still have weapons, plus supply to weapons from all the fighting that's going on in South Sudan. And so they're going to be basically, the Turkana are not going to be armed. These raiders from South Sudan are going to be coming into Kenya all the time, killing people. And then the Kenyan government's going to have to send military out to Turkana to defend it if the Turkana aren't armed. So it actually is recently, and it's not official, but the places where Turkana get their arms a lot of times are from the Kenyan government, because they would rather Turkana were fighting the Toposa from South Sudan as opposed to the army. So and the politics of it change a lot. And so like at any time the government policies change a lot, and it's really in flux, but it's kind of like that's where I think it's kind of equilibrium. And also it used to be that these pastoral groups, like right now, I mean it used to be that there was a lot more mixing of these groups in the territory, but because of this, the Kenyan government pushes the Toposa out when they come in too far, and the South Sudanese government, or the Ugandan government pushes the Turkana out when they get too far. And so the ethnic boundaries have kind of become the national boundaries just kind of by default through this process of people would rather the fighting was going across border than like within the country. So that's maybe a long answer to your question, but yeah, the whole national politics and army thing on top of it is a whole other set of institutions. But yeah, they could get arrested, and sometimes they do. So it is just political for the most part. And sometimes the animals, they'll run up a bunch of animals in Turkana and send them back to Posa land. Yeah.
I had a question on that slide too.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to whether there's like a Western equivalent of this, because you presented it as very specific to these people.
Yeah.
But one thing I could think of, and I'm guessing there's a better example, but one thing I could think of is listening to people talk about police-involved shootings,
Right.
and whether or not the police have a right to shoot someone only when they've shot first or something like that.
Okay.
And it seems like people especially if you hear police officers talking about it, like, no, it's important that, you have this ability to choose at the moment. It's, your life is at stake or whatever. So you get to decide if someone's really a threat to your life or not. And other people are like, no, like only if they fire first or only if. So I don't know, do you think that this is really something that's specific to these people, or do you think that you might see a similar?
Yeah.
Being like West
What do you mean by specific? You mean like the moral autonomy part, or?
Yeah.
No, I don't think it's specific at all. I think that there is a difference in, and I haven't talked about the police context, but in the as much, so I think about this more. But in the military context, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to refuse an order, and even if you know, so like the military after Vietnam really started emphasizing the order has to be lawful, which means if you're ordered to shoot up a village, you're not supposed to do it. Now, whether that happens or not, you know, sometimes people follow the order anyway because there's reasons why you might want to do that. But my impression is Turkana would have, like, if someone just wants to give up, then like, no, I'm not doing this. Like, there's not, they're able to do that. And I have another slide that might maybe get more into this, which is sanctioning. So why would they be able to do this? Okay, so here's another vignette. And I kind of made up this one. So this is not something that, oh no, I didn't make, okay, yeah, I didn't make this one up. Okay, so here, oh, sorry, I made it up as based on a real story. All right, okay, so again, we have this meeting of the raid. During a meeting before the raid leader decides that the warriors should not kill elderly people. So that was a decision that the leader made. I made that part up because that never came up. However, during the raid, a warrior, Esakone, purposely kills an old woman. Would anyone punish Esakone for not following the raid leader's decision? So you have a decision, and so this is the question: is like, how much authority does the raid leader have? And here, 50% said that that person would be punished, and 85% said they wouldn't. And one thing about punishment in Turkana is it's not top down. Like, you really, if someone violates a norm, and I'll talk about some of these norms later, then the punishment is communal, meaning that that person's age group, so people about the same age, other men, the age group doesn't want to get a bad reputation, so they'll punish people that don't conform to norms, and they'll all decide amongst themselves whether someone deserves to be punished or not, and it's a group decision. So if you had 85% of people saying this person should be punished for something, and 50% of people saying that they shouldn't be punished, that person's not going to get punished because you don't have enough people on the side of punishment. Which means that you have to have like enough people have to agree with your norm before someone gets punished for it. Maybe it's kind of related to your question. And so this gets into the question of accidental killing. The next scenario is the same, except Mayan killed a little woman by accident when shooting into the compound instead of on purpose. And actually, like, these two people, this is out of 101 participants, these two participants said that everyone should be punished. So they just like punishment across the board, and they're the only people that answered punishment from the question. So the other people are just kind of reflecting their belief about who should be killed. And then you have two people that's really like punishing. And then the green are just people who didn't answer the question or we didn't get the data for whatever reason. And here are only 2% of people. So generally there's this idea that you shouldn't punish people for something they did on accident. And then the last one is the raid leader decided that you should kill all the enemies. And then someone decides not to kill an old woman when he has a chance, and should that person be punished? And then you get like 16%. So again, like not, and these are different. 14% of those people are different than the first question. So you have, again, people that thinking that you should punish. This kind of shows that, like, yeah, if you're the raid leader to make a decision on this, especially on this scenario about who you should kill and who you shouldn't, there isn't a lot of sanctioning institutions, which means that you expect the norms not to be very strong by the evolutionary theory, because you should only expect norms to be strong if there's some consequence for violating them. In this case, there really doesn't seem to be either way. Either you kill someone when you're maybe not supposed to, or you refuse to kill someone when maybe you should. And in the Western military scenario, you might expect more punishment if someone kills someone they're not supposed to or not. And I just wanted to point out that it's not like there's anarchy. So they do have more norms about certain things that are strongly enforced. And this is previous works of my collaborator, where she's interested in how people solve the collection action problem. So, and some stuff that came out of my interviews is like if someone kills another Turkana during battle, like maybe there's a dispute over who gets the animals, or maybe for some other reason, then there's a lot of sanctioning for that. Like that person will probably be beat pretty badly, and also probably lose a lot of their animals. Like his agents will come and definitely take whatever animals he would have gotten on the raid and distributes it to the person who's the family of the person that they killed. Like that happens a lot, and it might not even be done out in the open. So people don't want their age set to get a bad reputation. So it might be that like after the fact, like there's like an anonymous donation of animals to that person's family from this age set in general, that basically got taken from this person. So they don't let it get out like why that was if this person killed somebody. Also, cowardice, if someone is like free riding during a raid, that's a good reason that people get beat for that. The arguments of the distribution of animals or violating instructions of the diviner is something else that people get punished for, which I didn't put in the talk, but I'll talk about later if you want to. The other thing that Turkana have, which Western militaries don't, are, specifically in the case of killing, are different signaling institutions. I put this one in. Okay, so this one's not about killing, but there's various ceremonies associated with going to battle. This one is an aknyak, which is a kind of a warrior dance that before people go in a large raid, the community puts on to say, like, we're excited you're going on to a large raid, we hope you get lots of animals, and it's signaling from the community that what they're doing is acceptable or morally good. And then these ones are associated with killing. There are 3 separate rituals that warriors do or can go through if they've killed someone in battle. The first one is called akapor, which is a purification ritual. I can go into details of how these rituals work, but basically what that does is it's just like you've killed someone in battle, and this purifies you from whatever harm comes from that. There's another one called, and all these rituals are done in groups of men, and the people that are involved in rituals are men who have killed in battle. So someone comes back and they go through this ritual. Everyone else in the space, including the people that lead it, are other men who have killed in battle. So I made the mistake of interviewing all the men about this, and I realized the people who had never been part of the ritual gave like really weird stories about what happened in the ritual. And actually what happens is weird, so it's kind of hard to tell which is weird, but then I realized I really had to talk to people who had gone through it. Yeah.
Did you get a sense from the men who had undergone the purification rituals that they derived moral relief from it?
Yeah, it's, I don't have a sense of that. Like I don't have enough of that to give you a good answer on that. I do know that people like say like if you don't go through akapor specifically, so I asked them what happens if you don't go through it. It's like, oh, you slowly waste away and you die. You either eventually do it or you'll slowly waste away and die. You become weaker and weaker and weaker and eventually. I mean, which happens to everybody, but I think it's accelerated. It was accelerated. And in our sample, like everyone who said they kill, it was pretty close to 100% of people that had akapor. I don't remember exactly 100, but it was 99 or 100%.
Seems like that could be sort of an important psychological, benefit, I guess, or protective.
Right. I mean, there's a reason why people do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what they say the reason they do it is to avoid being wasted away, but I mean, I guess it's probably a more avoidance thing. But it's hard to know. You can't randomly assign people to do akapor, right? It'd be nice if you could randomly, but that's how it works. And then so there's this thing, people often will have what we call waking dreams here, or nightmares, but people often will say that their nightmares are the enemy that they killed in battle is coming to kill them. And they'll talk about waking dreams like you wake up and they're paralyzed and they can't do anything. And often when people kill, actually it's often done right after akapor, it's like part of the same ceremony, is that people will do nidabus, which protects them from ghosts being haunted. And it doesn't always work. People say it works, but then we interviewed one, and they can do this either right after they've killed or whenever they get haunted to try to get the hauntings to go away. And we had one man I interviewed, remember being an old man, had done nidabus maybe 20-something times over a 10-year period. So every few months he would start getting nightmares again and then go to the ceremony again. He'd say it helped for a while, but then he kept doing it. Most people don't have, a lot of people don't have nightmares at all, but do it anyway. But then it works, right, because you've done it. So that's another ritual. And then there's one Akager, and Akager, this is a warrior who is at Akager, and it's a ritual scarring. And this one is completely optional. The old men said in their day everyone did it, but the young men, some is about, I think about 30%. No, people who had killed, it's like 45% of people have done Akager. And it's a ritual scarring, and basically they have a ceremony again just with the men who have killed in battle, and they take a small hook, a special hook, and they pull up the skin and slice it with like a razor blade. And they just do that over and over again. And it heals up into patterns of scars, kind of like this. And it used to be, the old men will say, like, we did the first person killed was here, and the second one was here, and then he went to the back. And the young men kind of just do it wherever they want. We've asked people why they don't do it, which I did. Some of them say because it really hurts. And like, and also like if you don't want to do it, like your sister or your wife can choose to do it for you on your behalf. So some of the women have these scars, and I think it was idea that they're tougher than the men, which kind of makes sense. So you'll see some women with the scars, and they did either for their brother or their husband. And it's kind of seen as like a pride thing. And some people say it's just showing off, and I don't like to show off, so I don't want to do that, because why do I want to say I'm better than everyone else because I have it? And some guys say is when they go, the thing about the Toposa, who they raid with a lot, is they also during peacetime hang out with them. They spend time with them, and they sing songs, they know the same stories, they recognize each other by their faces, and definitely by the names of the bulls, which they yell out in battle. And they say, like, I don't want to have all these scars, because when the Toposa see me during peacetime, they'll mark me and say, oh, this is someone who's killed a lot of Toposa, so we should target that person next time it's during their time. And they'll say that. Or kill me, like, after we have this dancing together, you know, they might sneak off and try to kill me, so I don't want to become a target. So those are the three reasons why people say they don't do it. But you know, a good number of people do it. And it's kind of optional. But this is like signaling, and these people are seen by a lot of people as not everybody, but it's a sign of respect. So it kind of is signaling that what they've done in battle killing is accepted socially. Yeah.
How are you doing on time? What you just said prompted a question, but I don't want to derail you.
I don't even know. Paul told me I have like an hour and a half now,
Yes,
so
there's 30 minutes left in the whole thing.
I'm doing pretty well on time.
Okay, because
I'll
what
come
you
towards
just
the
said painted, like, in a haiku-like way, a really different picture of the inner group antipathy or lack thereof.
Yeah.
So you're conjuring an image of people who have this sort of transactional violence where it's like, well, you know, these animals aren't going to just appear out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal your animal, and you're going to try to steal mine, and then we'll have a beer later.
Right.
I mean, is that what it's like? Or you would expect there to, in order to engage in this kind of, these kind of mutual attacks, there would have to be some kind of mediating animus or a motivation, some kind of ideology, or is that not the case at all?
It's complicated. It's a mix. So there's individual variation for sure about attitudes. And on top of it, there are some like non-governmental organizations that try to get Toposa and Turkana to hang out together during peacetime. And so often the leaders often have animals, right? Because why they're leaders, like the elders, and you're getting the anthropologist's answer, which is complicated. Okay, so you have the elders, and they have animals, right? So they don't want to be a lot of raiding, because they don't want people to come take their animals, so they're often making peace. And then what ends up happening, the cycle ends up being that the young men, after a certain amount of time, are like basically violating what the elders want and try to go get animals and start exploiting it. There have been a couple of pretty big raids by the Toposa that have killed a lot of Turkana, and where they targeted women and children indiscriminately. This is from the Turkana perspective. And people involved in that raid, but not all of them, tend to have a lot more amicus. Animus. Can you say that word? They tend to be a lot more upset with the Toposa and they're more things rich. And it doesn't necessarily they're going on. There was one guy I met who just like, I for like 2 years went and just went to Toposa land and killed people because I was so angry. There was one person like that. So, but most people will say like, well, I'm there. I just don't bother sparing anyone because they killed these member of my family, children and adults. There are other people that weren't involved in that who don't have that kind of that ill feeling towards Toposa, who say like, yeah, you know, I just want animals. Toposa are just like us. Everyone will say that. Toposa are just like us. They have the same songs. They have the same language. We come from the same people, which are the Jie. And you know, and they emphasize that a lot. And so there's this anthropologist, Scott Atran, who does works with violent radical terrorists, basically. And so he'll go into, he has these measures of essentialism, which is like how much you think another group is different than you, which if you are more essentialist, you're more likely to commit violence against them. And so he'll go and ask Palestinians, you know, if an Israeli or a Jewish child is born and then raised by a Palestinian family, would that child be, when they grow up, will they be Israeli or Jewish, or would they be Palestinian or Islamic? And people with more essentialist beliefs that say like, oh, that person is still a Jew or still Israeli, tend to advocate violence more. In Turkana, there was like, in the whole 213, there was 2 people that had those kind of beliefs that we interviewed. Everyone else said like, a Toposa baby raised by Turkana grows up to be Turkana. Turkana baby raised by Toposa would grow up to be Toposa. And they're very clear, like even like that's a ridiculous question to ask, of course. So they don't seem to have that kind of belief. And when you ask like why you fight, it's almost always like, because we did this during a pilot. Everyone said, hunger for animals. It's like, I just want animals. So in that case, it's transactional.
And then even in the case of the minority of people who express anger or revenge as a motivation for raiding, it sounded, just the way you described it, as if this were personal. Like my family, my friends, not on behalf of the Turkana.
Yeah, it's pretty personal. I mean, people have pretty big families, so, but yeah, for those people it is. But even then, it's like, except for that one guy, it's like, I'm going to get animals, but while I'm there, it's not like I'm going to, so these guys are walking 100 kilometers in the desert with very little water to go on this raid, so it's pretty costly. And people just, I don't think, are willing to do that just for revenge for the most part. Like, they're going to get animals, and if it comes to the point where like there's an opportunity there, then maybe they'll kill somebody or not care if they're shooting into the crawls and kill people on accident. So, but I think the short answer is it's really complicated and kind of depends on the individual. Is my impression. So, but yeah, I was surprised by how little hatred there was about the both sides, how much people emphasize and so much versus the differences. And another thing with Turkana is that most of the men, at least in this part of Turkana, in the Kwartela people, almost everyone else has been on raids or has some raiding experience or has been on the receiving end, and especially even for the women of a certain age on the receiving end. And so everyone they interact with knows where they're coming from. So it's not like you're sending people to Iraq or Afghanistan and they come back and their family is generally supportive of the military and their service, and they say thank you for the service, but as soon as they start talking about the killing and the death they saw, and you hear this, we read things from veterans, they complain about this all the time, people don't want to hear it, right? They give you signals like, I don't want to talk about this is awful. And it gives people maybe the signal that what they did was morally wrong and all the stuff they experienced is evil. But for the Turkana men, like if you're sitting around like that, this is during a study we did, but often men, when they are not hurting animals by themselves, or especially the older men like this, they're sitting around talking, and what they're talking about, in my just anecdotal experience, is about a third of the time they're talking about like who's marrying who, or they're talking about something that happened at a dance or a dance the night before. But most of what they're talking about is raiding and their raiding days and their experiences. And young men are talking about raids and when they're going to go on a raid and how many got animals on the raid, and what happened on the raid. And so like when I come in and ask them questions, I'm just like a new audience for them. Like it's very easy to get people to talk to me because that's what they're doing anyway. They're talking to each other, and now I'm asking lots of weird questions about when you got back from the raid, did you have these flashbacks, right? And so it's like kind of novel for them to get that, but that's what they're doing all the time, which is for a lot of military combat veterans, that doesn't happen. Like you have VA programs where they try to get veterans together, and you have things like the VFW that have these things, but it's not like their entire society is like that. People have to go out and seek that, and sometimes don't find it. And so we think that might be an important component where you just have this acceptance of this is how warfare is, and this is what happens that you don't get in Western society. And part of the problem is there's like 3 different things there, so it's really hard to tell which of these things is what, if any of things, cause this decrease in moral injury. We're running a paper now for clinicians, and so they really care about so what. And so we suggested it's really hard to, if you're interested in decreasing moral injury in Western combat veterans, part of it's kind of weird because you don't necessarily want killing to be, or if an example of killing to be something that people think is morally right. Like you want there to be rules of behavior. So the question is, how do you, and also you don't necessarily want like everyone live in Turkana society, right? Like that's probably not going to be very good. And clinically it's hard because you can't randomly assign soldiers to grow up Turkana and have them fight in a war or not to see what works. These kind of things seem to be like societal level changes that are really hard if you're a clinician to implement. But we made some recommendations based on what we have here that might work, but we'll take more research. One is like maybe if you could figure out a way in the military to give people more moral autonomy. I don't know how that would work, but give people more ability to not follow orders. Which sounds weird to me as a military guy because I just don't see how it would work, but that's an option. Another is like there aren't any, as far as I know, really, there's lots of military ceremonies, but there aren't really for people who have killed. And even like medals we give out, medals of honor, like killing might happen during a medal of honor. Like this person destroyed 10 German machine guns. You don't actually say they killed how many people, but it's all kind of incidental to some other act of heroism, right? And so it's not really a good signal that what you did, like killing is good. It's just a signal that, or fine. It's a signal that heroism is good, or saving people's lives is often what the words are going to do. And it's not like you have to give someone a medal for killing, like this is my 300 persons killed medal, but you could maybe have some sort of somber, appropriate ceremony to acknowledge this moral burden that people might have from doing that, and acknowledge it and try to do it similar to the Turkana rituals. It probably wouldn't be the rituals involve slaughtering animals and scarring your body, but it could be something similar, similar type of idea. And the other one is try to foster in community and community support and figuring out how to get people to actually talk to other veterans, actually talk to each other, which, to be fair, clinicians do, but also more community acceptance, not just of thanking people for their service, but also the acceptance of the moral burden that people have taken on, which just isn't there, because generally people just want to ignore those kind of really terrible parts of war. Okay, so this is kind of ongoing research. One thing we've done is we've collected saliva samples from a lot of men, some with high PTSD scores and some without, to try to figure out if the same type of, I'll explain. So cortisol, people with PTSD seem to have lower cortisol sensitivity than people without, on average. And so we're trying to see if Turkana have the same thing, both because it'd be interesting just in and of itself, but also because we'd like to see if there's some biological component that is similar between the two. And it also gives an idea of like whether our measures are consistent. One thing I discovered, which I thought was interesting, is that we started interviewing women about PTSD because women are often on the receiving ends of raises POSA. But we also found out that significant, not a huge fraction, but around 7% or so of women have killed during these defensive raids, which is most pastoral groups wouldn't happen. Turkana women are actually a lot less subservient to men than in other pastoral groups, and often these killings happen where a man gets injured, front to post a man, or some raider gets injured, and then the women are following behind the Turkana who are doing the fighting, and then the Turkana men will call the women over to end up killing the man who they injured, basically by stoning or beating to death. And so there's a lot of women who have participated in that, and so we're trying to get an idea of why certain women choose to and not, and whether they have any kind of moral injury symptoms from that too. There's a couple women who have picked up guns and like killed a few guys, and they have like this, they got the scars and everything. And they have like an enemy name, and they're pretty badass women. But overall, we've expanded into interviewing some of the women. The other thing is, in 2 weeks, we're doing a cross-cultural workshop at ESU Center for Evolutionary Medicine. We're going to have something like 12 different anthropologists from different groups, actual clinicians that are going to come in that study moral injury as their job, and a few public health people. And we're going to try to put together a larger cross-cultural sample. Because one of the issues is we have Turkana, and we have kind of these Western veteran populations, but there's lots of differences. And by sampling more cultures and more types of trauma, we can maybe get to a greater understanding of what the different determinants are, instead of just saying, there's an infinite number of differences between Turkana, and we can get that to like infinity minus 5 or something. So, all right, so this is, I want to thank the funders and the institutions that hosted us, and especially our research assistants who would not be possible to do this study without people who speak English and Turkana enough to talk to people about really sensitive issues like blood rating and PTSD. All right, this is my summary slide, so this is the end. So I started saying there's this big debate about the origins of PTSD, and describing a study that we did with Turkana warriors. And we found that some symptoms of PTSD and the standard kind of DSM conception of it are relatively lower in the Turkana. And we think that moral injury, differences in moral injury might explain these differences. We think evolutionarily there's different origins of PTSD and moral injury, where PTSD is a fear response to a traumatic experience that should be pretty context independent, where moral injury depends on the particular norms and expectations of the society. And we think that there might be some things about Turkana institutions for Turkana society that limits the instance of moral injury, specifically in the case of killing, though maybe not in other contexts. That's it. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.